I'm Sarah Wilson and you're listening to the Roots and All podcast. I'm here to help you get growing. Join me as I explore everything plant related both indoors and out and provide the information you need to create your perfect green environment. Hello and welcome to this episode of the podcast. I recorded this interview a while ago and I've been deliberating when to release it because it is a bit different to a lot of the recent episodes which have been mainly concerned with gardening. I first heard Robin speak at a day that was organised by Toby Diggins, who I interviewed in episode 10. If you haven't listened, you must. It's all about aesthetic ecology and it's a listener favourite. I was so impressed with Robin's approach to growing vines and the way in which he works so closely with the land, the way he manages his estate for the vines but also for native flora and fauna. And although I'm pretty clueless about winemaking, I thought the methods he and his partner Georgina used to produce their wines was also fascinating. When I heard Robin speak, I was already half on the lookout for someone to interview about biodynamic growing, and he's really clued up on it, and I thought he could explain it in a very down-to-earth way that wouldn't have you running for the hills and shouting about witchcraft or damn hippies. I started the interview by asking Robin about his life prior to running Limeburn Hill.
Well, I come from originally an architecture background. So I studied architecture and worked as an architect, and then I studied landscape architecture and worked as a landscape architect. But before that, I always wanted to be a farmer. I think when I was a little kid, I wanted to be a farmer, and I was always advised not to be. I think it was in the 1970s. It was possibly not the best time to be a farmer. It certainly wasn't a profession that anybody was very positive about. And I seem to have spent my life going around and around trying to get back to it. So moving from architecture to landscape architecture, was a way of working with the landscape, even if it was from a distance. And then I started teaching it, which got me out of the office and started working with people who were enthusiastic about it, with students. I had a little sort of landscape design and construction business for a while, which put me more in touch with the earth. And from then, I then moved into, well, actually, I worked as a shiatsu practitioner. So I worked with the energy, sort of healing energy of the body, while I was teaching. And when I finished the teaching job, I then set up the vineyard with my partner, my wife, Georgina. And interestingly, the vineyard kind of brings everything together. So it brings in the idea of working with the land, obviously, but also working with place, so sense of place, which comes from the landscape architecture, and working with little buildings. So I'm building everything that we need to store equipment or to make things to do with the biodynamic preparations. But also there's the sort of the energetic aspect of shiatsu, which comes in quite well, working with the sort of the scent, trying to get a sense of what plants would benefit from and what would help them grow as well as possible. So that's how it's kind of started. And then we decided to set it up. We both wanted to work together, Georgina and I, and we both wanted to work outside. We both wanted to work in nature. And we talked about various different things. Eventually, we both came up with the idea separately, which we then shared, about running a vineyard. And then we visited a few vineyards and realised that it is possible to make amazing wine in England. And so we visited a few organic vineyards in the UK. Yes, and that gave us the sort of the belief that it was possible, and that's why we started. Yeah.
And what do you produce from your vineyard? This probably sounds like a daft question, but
No, lots of different wines that you can produce. We have 6 different grape varieties. They're all what are called, or most of them are what are called hybrids, which are a cross between quite a well-known, maybe an older grape variety, say Cabernet Sauvignon or Sauvignon Blanc or Riesling or something like that, crossed with disease-resistant varieties to make them more suitable for the English climate and also more suitable to organic and biodynamic growing. Also, out of those comes we make 3 different wines. At the moment, we make 3 different wines, which are all a kind of wine which is called Pétillant Naturel. and that is it's a type of wine which is a traditional French sparkling wine. So it's not using the champagne method, which creates a different kind of wine. It's a single fermentation sparkling wine, and that it's a little bit like the way that you make elderflower champagne. So you bottle it just before it's finished fermenting, and so we measure the sugars very, very accurately, sort of every hour, through a couple of days until we get the precise amount of sugar left in the fermentation, and then we bottle it, and that creates a sparkling wine. And the wines that we make are a sparkling white, a sparkling rosé, and a sparkling red. So it's the first Pétillant Naturel red made in the UK, and it captures. The reason that we make it that way is that it captures the flavours of the grapes. So the beautiful fruit flavours of the grapes. This is a process which captures that, whereas traditional method, the champagne method sparkling, actually gets rid of most of the fruit flavours and replaces them with more savoury flavours, sort of bready or yeasty, malty flavours, which you associate more with a champagne or a prosecco. So it's very exciting, actually.
Yeah, it sounds it, and unique as well.
It's completely unique, yeah.
So, well, you mentioned that you're organic, but you're also biodynamic. So can you explain a little bit about what that involves?
Yes, biodynamics is an agricultural system, or an approach to agriculture that was developed by Rudolf Steiner in the 1920s. So it's a system that it started when a series of farmers contacted him to ask for his views on agriculture, because they'd been introduced to the new pesticides and the new fertilizers and the new seeds after the First World War, and they were having all these wonderful yields, and the vegetables were much bigger, but they began to recognize that the soil was getting worse, and the nutritional value of the food was actually getting worse as well. They were collecting seed from the veg, but the seeds were not viable, and the wildlife and the sort of associated habitat around the farms was also degrading. And so they went to Steiner because of his sort of polymath approach, his hugely broad understanding of the world, for his views, and he gave a series of lectures which outlined biodynamic agriculture, and it was the first organic agriculture system that was written down, that was certified. The Soil Association, I think, started in the 50s, and it kind of set the seed for the organic movement. A lot of the people who were on those original courses with Steiner then went on to develop the organic agriculture certification systems around the world. So it kind of set the scene for it. So biodynamics includes all of the organic ideas. So it includes the idea that you don't use systemic chemicals, that you look after the soil, that you don't spray pesticides and herbicides and so on. But there's a series of additional points which biodynamics works with. So it works with a series of medicinal herb preparations. So Steiner outlined 9 different preparations which are applied in various different ways to the vineyard. So those include dandelion flowers, nettle, chamomile, using oak bark, and a few others. And they're all transformed in some way, so they're all broken down in some way into their constituent parts. And you can kind of look at it in different ways. Steiner talked about it from a spiritual point of view, sort of an esoteric point of view, that each have certain qualities which that then brings to the soil and the land and the harvest, the crop. But they also bring in very sort of material aspects, i.e. We use a lot of yarrow, and yarrow has high sulfur content in it. We use horsetail, which has a high silica content in it, which helps dry out leaves and prevent mildew. And various other things have high potassium content and high phosphorus content and so on. So it's kind of a mixture of the spiritual and the material. And that's also one of the key ideas of biodynamics, is that you work in both a sort of an energetic, emotional, spiritual way, as well as a material and physical way. And you're combining the two all the time. Other aspects are that we work with the cycles of the nature. So we work with the moon cycles. So we plant, we harvest. If possible, we do our plant sprays on certain days, which are more associated with different parts of the plant. So there's a calendar that's been developed over the last 80 or so years, which outlines certain days are better for working with the roots of a plant. So that's when we would actually do transplants or maybe grafting, and other days that might be more associated with leaves. So we might do a compost tea spray on those days, and so on. So we do our best to work to that, but in the English climate, it certainly isn't the easiest thing to follow. So we certainly don't follow that too rigorously.
No, I can imagine, and especially when you have sheep appearing out of nowhere, I imagine.
Exactly, yes.
So when I heard you speak before, you were talking about I knew I was going to mess that up. Salutogenic approach that you take to growing. So does that fit into that whole biodynamic way of growing? And can you describe that a little bit?
Yes, absolutely. Before that, actually, one of the ideas that leads into that is one of the principles Steiner talked about was trying to work with the idea of the farm as an organism. So thinking of the farm as almost as a living being in itself, and your role is to understand all the systems on that farm, and support those systems as best you can, if possible, within the farm itself. So, for example, we might lay a hedge, and the trimmings that we take from that, we will chip down, we'll turn into a compost, and we'll put those on the vines. The grape mark, which is the skins and stems that are left over after wine making, we'll then bring back and compost again, and those might go around the apple trees, for example. We have willow stands, which we use to treat wastewater, and we use the willow to make a willow tea, which is high in particular acids which help prevent disease on the vine, and so on. So we try and work in cycles within the farm and think of it as an organism, almost as if the farm has a character, which links a little bit back into this idea of it having a sense of place. And so the idea of a salutogenic approach, means that we focus on the health. We focus on health as opposed to disease. And when I first read about this, I didn't quite understand it, because it's so ingrained in our way of thinking, I think, about the world, but also certainly in agriculture, that you're always looking for the next problem and how you can solve that problem. So in the vine growing world, people are always talking about mildew. You've got to deal with powdery mildew, you've got to deal with downy mildew, you've got to deal with botrytis, which is the rot you might get on the grapes. You might deal with that pest or that pest. And the focus is very much on dealing with disease or pests, whereas we try and think about the vines. What situation, what condition can we create that will make the vines as healthy as possible? So our focus is not really on looking for disease, it's on what do these vines need in order to be as healthy as possible. And out of that will come a natural balance. So the relationship with the soil and the microbes and the air and the sun and so on will achieve a certain balance, and that will make them as healthy as possible, and that will give them a level of resistance as well. So that's the idea of a salutogenic approach. It sounds very obvious when you say it, but actually it changes your perception about everything. And I do find myself falling back into this, oh no, we might get disease, so therefore I have to do that. Whereas I can, if I sit there and think, actually, what do the vines really want now? I look at them and think, actually, this is what they need. This is what would make them healthier. And we don't get disease. So at the moment, it seems to be working.
Yeah, I don't think it sounds easy, actually. I think it sounds as if you need to be incredibly tuned into your place, which sadly I think is not so easy for us nowadays. So, yeah.
That's a really interesting point, actually. Yeah, because one thing that biodynamics really does is it demands that you connect with place. So you have to connect with your land, you have to understand it, and you have to be in it. So we do a lot of work by hand. I do a lot of walking up and down the vines, and I do a lot of whatever the herbal tea spray or the compost tea sprays that we do. I'm open to the air when I'm doing it, so I'm connecting with every vine. Whereas the traditional recommendation is you sit in a tractor cab, you're enclosed, you spray your chemicals, the vine absorbs them, and you don't make those connections. So you are distanced in so many ways from the place. So yes, and another interesting thing about it is that understanding has developed over time. So this is our 5th year, and my connection with the land has changed so much. So being there every day, working with the vines, and seeing them go through this yearly cycle, and have various different situations, conditions, really, the connection that I have with the land has changed completely, and it's changed me as well. So there's it's a very personal impact that working biodynamically has, in an extremely positive way. I wouldn't change it at all.
Yeah, no, I bet you have to be completely immersed in it. Otherwise, there's so many things that you would miss. So because your site is so specific and it is such a kind of community within itself, does that have an effect, or does that express itself in how the end product actually tastes?
Definitely. Yes. So one of the things the responses that we've had from our wine to our wines this year, because we've made our first vintage was made last year, is that no one's tasted anything like them, and that's not in a bad way. That's actually in a good way. And the way that we do it is we work with these particular varieties which we thought would grow well on this site, so suited to the soil, suited to the climate, suited to the aspects, and so on. But we work with the wild yeast, which is growing naturally on the grapes. So most wines in England, in fact most wines across the world, the way that they're made is that a winemaker they'll do the harvest, they'll then put lots of sulfites on the grapes once they've been crushed or pressed to kill all of the wild yeast that's on them, and they'll then add an industrially made yeast, which will give them exactly the wine that they want. So a Riesling will have a particular yeast that you will buy from a manufacturer, and you will then add it, and it will enhance the flavour of Riesling. Whereas we use the wild yeast that's on the grapes. We do this in a very, I think it's a really special way. It's a little bit like, always feels a little bit like alchemy or witchcraft, where we go and collect grapes the week before the main harvest. We crush them on the vineyard by hand, and we put them in this glass jar, and then we seal that jar, and so we know that the only thing that's in that jar is the grapes and the yeast that's on those grapes. And then we warm it to about, if it's not warm enough, we warm it to about 25 degrees, and that initiates the wild yeast to grow. So we take the grapes, we crush them, and then we add this starter ferment. It's called a pied de cuve, which is a French term, which we don't have an English term for it, and that kick-starts the fermentation. So therefore we know that fermentation is happening with the yeast from the vineyard. And the interesting thing about that is that it might go through 50 or 100 or 200 different yeasts while it ferments from 0% alcohol through to 10% alcohol. So instead of having one yeast which does the whole lot, you might have 100 yeasts, and each yeast brings a different flavour. And so what you end up with is a wine which can only taste of the place that it's come from. So 2 fields away, it's got slightly different conditions. There'll be slightly different yeast. Some will be the same, some will be different, and therefore that wine would taste different. So in many ways, it is the kind of the pure concept of terroir, which is wine that tastes of its place. And unfortunately, 99.9% of vineyards across the world don't follow that at all.
No, well, I guess they're trying to aim for consistency, especially year on year, whereas if you've got a slightly more flexible approach, then that's the beauty of it, that it can vary probably quite dramatically, I guess.
Possibly. We don't know.
You can find out.
We made a few bottles the previous year of this Pétillant Naturel Pet Nat Rosé, and we've made a similar one last year from about the same proportions. The one previous year, there were certain flavours which came through which were very similar, and certain flavours which were in the previous one which are not in this one. It means that every bottle of wine tastes not only of that place but of that time.
Yeah.
So it is completely of its place and time, which is quite a beautiful idea.
Yeah, it really is. Would your thinking back to your landscape architecture career, would your landscape architect self have had any truck with biodynamics, or have you kind of come to that through, down the years?
I think no. As myself, I would have loved to have worked in that way. I didn't know about biodynamics when I was a landscape architect, not really anyway. But I would always teach to not use systemic chemicals, to not use herbicides and glyphosate and so on, and find ways of creating landscapes which work in such a way that you don't need those chemicals. So I was always very teaching in that way and working in that way. I think that the main difficulty, the main conflict between the two approaches is that as a landscape architect, you're working primarily for somebody else. So in some ways you have to take on their ethical attitudes, their particular approach to the world. And if that's an individual client, say a single person, say if you're doing a large private scheme, then that might be fine because they might choose you because of your beliefs. If you're working for a housing developer to help them master plan 500 new houses near Swindon, then the chances are they're not going to have any interest in working in a natural way, in a organic way, and certainly not based on the phases of the moon. So it's very difficult to apply a particular personal ethical stance as a landscape architect, which is a real shame. Because I kind of think, yes, it says something about our development system more than anything else. It tells you some of the problems with our development system.
Definitely. So, I mean, a lot of people are sceptical of biodynamics, and even now, and like you say, particularly probably people who come from a background of maybe one of the professions such as landscape architecture. So a lot of people kind of say to me, well, is there any evidence that it works? Have you come across any evidence that's actually evidence-based research to say, yes, this does work, it does have a good effect on yield, the crops are healthier, and so on and so on?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, there's quite a lot of evidence, actually. There was a big study. Let me think. It was a big study done in Switzerland. It lasted over 20 years, where they worked a large area, a whole series of different plots that were randomized, and they looked after them in a biodynamic way, in an organic way, and in a conventional way. And they took a whole series of measurements to do with yield, to do with nutrition, so nutritional value of the food, the soil microbe levels, organic matter, nutrients and minerals and that sort of thing, and biodiversity around the fields and that sort of thing. So they did a whole series of studies, a whole series of analyses, and yeah, what came out of that was quite clear that if you work organically or biodynamically, you will typically have a slightly smaller yield. So I think it worked out about 85%, something like that, on average. This is across a whole series of different crops. The nutritional value of the food will be a lot higher, so really quite significantly higher, i.e. per gram of food you get a certain amount of sodium or a certain amount of carbohydrate or whatever it might be, and you get a lot more from a biodynamic or an organic crop. And the big thing was, I think, was the soil health. The soil health in a biodynamic, on the biodynamic land, was a lot higher than the others. So the lowest was the conventional, obviously, because they were using herbicides and basically killed pretty much everything in the soil. And then the organic was a lot better than that, and then the biodynamic was better than that again. So that's a really interesting study because it was over such a long time. A similar thing was done. I was reading about a vineyard in America where they took a very large area of vineyards, and they applied basically the same processes to see what would happen with the grapes and the soil and so on. And they had exactly the same results. The big difference from a climate change point of view was that the biodynamic soil captured more carbon. So they found out that it was sort of 15% higher carbon capture in a biodynamic soil than an organic or a conventional soil. Something like that. And so yes, it's so much of biodynamics is about improving the soil. It's all, a lot of it is about composting. A lot of it is breaking stuff down and making the sort of really fantastic compost and helping that improve the soil. Working with a lot of plants local to that area or easily accessible to improve the soil. And the health of the crops and the nutritional value of the crops comes out of that. I mean, there's a lot of other things connected with it, but really, improving the soil is the way to go because we're degrading our soils, in such a terrible way. Oh, a really interesting one. This is about the planting by the moon. It's interesting that we've only worked biodynamically with a vineyard, so we don't have any comparison in relation to a vineyard. But I read a piece of research by a guy called Mark Moody, and he did a test whereby he planted a row of potatoes 7 days before the full moon, and a row next to it 6 days before, and a row next to it 5 days before. So a week before a full moon, and a week after a full moon. And he then treated them exactly the same once they were planted, and then harvested them all at exactly the same time, and measured the yield. And the yield for the 7 days before the full moon was a certain amount. 6 days before it went up, 5 days before it went up again, and it continued to go up more higher and higher, more steeper and steeper, until the day before the full moon. And then on the day of the full moon, either what they'd been planted on the day of the full moon, the yield dropped right down. And the day for the potatoes that had been planted just after the full moon, it went right back up again, and then dropped down again. So it was a very, very clear graph. People have been working with these cycles for centuries, millennia probably. Every tour that I do, and I tell people about the moon cycles, someone says, "Oh, my grandfather does that," or "My husband does that," or my sister works like that. She learnt it from her mother. That it's older knowledge that people still use, and they use it because it works. Why it works, I couldn't tell you. There may be ideas about it. I know that there are ideas about gravity and the level of water in the soil and that sort of thing. But I don't know. We as human beings are affected by the moon, because a lot of us is made up of water, and so we are impacted by that. And so plants are primarily water, so you can see that they would be impacted by it as well. But we don't understand exactly how that manifests, really.
No. Well, sometimes we tend to dismiss things if we can't understand it or can't reason it out. So I can understand why that might have fallen out of favour.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, it doesn't fit in with the Green Revolution.
No, and you can't prove it scientifically, one way or the other. So again, it must not be real. So I actually, as you were talking, I was interested. Do you underplant your vines with anything?
That's another big part of vineyards is what happens underneath the vines. When we started the vineyard, we had Mypex down, so it's a sort of a plastic mulch, and we had that down for a couple of years, and we didn't really want to use it, but we were advised by everybody that you've got to put something down, you've got to do something under the vines, and most people use a herbicide. They'll spray herbicide 3-4 times a year, and there'll be nothing under the vines. We obviously didn't want to do that, so we used Mypex. And it did reduce competition completely. But when we started taking it up after a couple of years to sort of look at the soil underneath, the soil was not healthy. It wasn't getting the water, and it wasn't getting the sun, and it wasn't getting the life. It was sort of very lacking in life. So we took it all away, and we've allowed the natural vegetation to grow under the vines. So after a couple of years, they've got a little bit of strength. The roots are set quite well. So we thought they'd be able to they would deal with competition quite well. And so we have allowed the natural flora to come back, and it's been fantastic. We grow our vines. We don't grow them in a traditional way. We don't grow them very close to the ground, which is what most vineyards do. We grow them about 1.5 meters off the ground. So what that does is it lifts them above the humidity of the grass. If you have too much humidity, then you've got a greater chance of bringing in diseases and that sort of thing. So our vines, and they want to grow up trees. They are a woodland plant. So we think growing them as high as possible is sort of the ideal scenario. And so we grow them quite high, and this allows us to have a whole series of flora under the vines. And it's developing. I don't know how many plants. I'd love to work out how many species we have, but it's we have about 30 different wildflower species which I've identified just from walking around, and these are actually under the vines, not on the edges of the land, but actually throughout the vineyard. We have butterflies everywhere. We have bees of all different kinds everywhere. Yes, so we allow nature to take over under the vines, and if we think it's going to start competing with the vines, then we will trim it back. So we'll cut it back. In fact, at the moment, I'm in the process of trimming back under the vines because we're about to put some bird netting on, because we have such a wonderful population of birds that it does mean that they would take pretty much all of the grapes if we didn't net. So just as the grapes are beginning to ripen, we have to net the whole vineyard, and the nets stay up for maybe a month, and then we harvest and then we take the nets down.
Yeah, I suppose you can't really avoid that, can you?
No, you can't have it both ways.
No.
So I love this sort of balance. It's like a game. We play we put up lots of bird boxes. We encourage as much diversity, and we have blackberries and sloe and hawthorn and elderberries everywhere. So full of birds of prey. We have maybe 4 or 5 different birds of prey that are regularly on the vineyard. But then, yes, the blackbirds have now started taking the grapes from the earliest ripening red grapes. So I'm netting tomorrow.
Right. I don't blame you. yeah,
it
you can only take so much. So if people wanted to find out more about your vineyard, I know you run courses as well, and it sounds like an idyllic place, and it sounds like you're doing everything brilliantly. So where would people find out more about the vineyard and also about the wines that you produce?
Well, we have a website, limeburnhillvineyard.co.uk. So you can just search for that on a search engine or put it in. We are just south of Bristol in the Chew Valley, near Chew Magna, and we run a series of tours through the year. I think next year we'll probably run a few more because we'll have a bit more wine next year. I've run 3 biodynamic wine growing workshops also this year, and so I'll be running more of those next year, which is a day-long introduction to biodynamic viticulture and winemaking. And it sort of introduces the basics of what biodynamics is, and then what vines are and how they grow and how we look after them, and then how we make the wine. So they've been really popular of this year, which has been fantastic. The tours, we've probably run about one a month, something like that, through May through to September. I also do talks. I'm giving a talk to the local gardening society, and also the Avon Organic Society, or Organic Gardening Society, next year.
So that's where you can see Robin if you're interested in finding out more, and please do check out his website, which is limeburnhillvineyard.co.uk. And if you're ordering wine from Robin, don't forget I'm always happy to receive Christmas gifts of the alcoholic sort. A really big thank you to Robin for the interview, and thanks to you for listening. I'll catch you next Tuesday. You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website www.rootsandall.co.uk, where you'll also find my blog and a sign-up form for the newsletter, which gives you a weekly roundup of content, plus the inside scoop on things like upcoming guests. Or you can subscribe wherever you normally get your podcasts. Email me with comments and feedback at podcast@rootsandall.co.uk. Follow me on Twitter, Roots and All, Facebook, Roots and All UK, and Instagram, Roots and All Pod. But please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support my work, because if you like what I do, please help me to continue doing it. Even if you make a one-off donation of £1, trust me, it all helps, and I will be immensely grateful. So please go to Patreon and search for Roots and All.